Heyo! Guess who finally got her computer back? It's me. So I wanted to really quickly just go over a couple of important notes concerning this week's lecture. I know it's already Thursday, but I thought better late than never. So, in any event, press freedom and the law. How prevalent is press freedom? Disappointing, not very prevalent at all. According to the Freedom House's 2015 report, our situation has deteriorated to probably the lowest point in over a decade. About 33% of the world's countries do not enjoy the right to free press at all, and another 36% enjoy only a partially free press. So it's only about a third of the world's countries benefit from full freedom of the press. Keeping in mind that when we are rating different systems of free press, the levels of censorship depend heavily on type of regime, but press freedom varies widely across both authoritarian and democratic systems, and journalists around the world are increasingly facing danger. This is a picture of Julian Assange. You may remember his situation of being assassinated. So, when you have the Freedom House, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that reports annually about press freedom throughout the world, they're looking at a number of different things. The figures that they're giving forth are based on laws that influence the content, what can and can't be printed or publicized or made available to journalists, political pressure, economic influences over media content, and then repressive actions like censorship, physical violence, imprisonment, or killing journalists. So he was a journalist, was assassinated, and the United States had held firm stance against that. So you can see here total number of media involved incidents that have been reported are with imprisoned journalists at a substantially higher level than 2 decades ago, which is problematic, a little concerning. You can see that journalist deaths are lower, but still substantially higher as well. So in the context of the United States, the First Amendment of our Constitution establishes 6 fundamental rights of the people, 2 of which pertain to the particular discussion at hand, which is free speech and press. We are guaranteed those rights, and thereby essentially providing it to a citizens, excuse me, with our check on government actions, institutions, and other individuals. So we have very narrowly defined limits and freedoms given to our press. Important note is that the amendment states that, First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, and that essentially makes the press the only private enterprise in the United States to give the Constitution privileged status, to which the Constitution gives a privileged status. Privileged status was given to the press because the founders considered the right to express opinions and to collect and disseminate information free from government interference as the bedrock of American society. So our democracy could not thrive without a free and open press. So our founding fathers actually didn't intend to ever have an outright, completely free press, free from government interference. Excuse me. They didn't want to completely ban any and all government action regarding freedom of the press. So you can see this in a number of different ways, that in the interpretations of what it means to have a free press and what kind of regulation government will allow has changed throughout the years, right? So, things like prior restraint. Prior restraint is restraints that are taking place, or the government stops publication of material prior to its release if they feel like it's pernicious to the publicity. They then have to forestall that expression before people are allowed to disseminate it itself. So, governments can prevent the publication of material if they feel it surely will result in a breach of national security, direct, immediate, and irreparable damage to our nation or to our nation's people. So that would have been one of the ways. And we still have areas of prior restraint today, but it is the responsibility of the federal government to prove that it would be an issue of national security. Moving forward, there are a number of ways that the government can still try and control the flow of information back and forth. And the U.S. press, I find ironic, is dependent largely on the government in order to make their news. So, although we are, as a nation, have press that is free to make generally news available, they still rely heavily on the government to gather that news. And we'll look at this a little bit later on. But moving forward, we have the Newseum Institute in D.C. has been doing since about late 90s, have been trying to collect annual survey data concerning public knowledge of the First Amendment. And it's kind of troubling. There's a figure in your book that discusses adults in the United States seem not to be well informed regarding their constitutionally guaranteed rights of freedom under the First Amendment. So of the 5 rights mentioned in the First Amendment, more than half of the respondents named freedom of speech when asked to identify, but directly after that, the second largest category was unable to name any. So it seems like that's a double-edged sword. 2015, only about 10% of the respondents mentioned freedom of the press, and that percentage has been on the decline since about 2009. So on average, only about a third of respondents were able to name even one of their First Amendment rights, but luckily if they do, it is freedom of speech. So then they went on to discuss whether or not adults agreed or disagreed with certain statements regarding their First Amendment rights. And the vast majority of respondents did agree that the functionality of our democracy benefits from having a free news media that acts as a watchdog over government. But far fewer respondents agree that the other 2 statements that are discussed in this particular graphic here. The First Amendment goes too far in guaranteeing its rights. So overall, the news media tries to report the news without bias, and First Amendment goes too far. You'll see drastically fewer agree than the 69%. So this is an important function of our democracy, saying that the news media acts as a watchdog is still on the decline. However, it is substantially higher than these other 2 questions asked. So one thing that's especially interesting to note is the first spike in agreement that the First Amendment goes too far occurs right after the 9/11 attack. So let's see here, about 2001. The second spike occurs after the Boston Marathon bombing. And that kind of reflects a common pattern for the American public, that during periods of unrest or when we're perceived at high levels of external threat or issues of national security, we're typically more willing to trade freedoms for security. Moving forward, when looking at the 2 different types of media, uncontrolled media versus controlled media, in an uncontrolled media, generally, the U.S. court's decisions hold that print media have nearly absolute freedom to determine what they will or they will not print and whose views they will or will not present, while cable television and internet enjoy the same freedoms because they are considered common carriers that transport people's messages. Those rules, however, do not apply equally to broadcast media, which are considered semi-monopolies and therefore are more heavily regulated as a result of the channel space that is limited. Okay, so the FCC believes that broadcasting public airways should require a license to maintain media and press accountability over that open public airspace. You'll see this also in several different regulations that have been imposed that we talked about briefly last time. The right to equal time, that if the station sells one bit of time to one candidate, they have to offer the same amount to the other candidate. Fair treatment, free airtime for the presentation of issues that are of public concern, the discussion then has to be on opposing viewpoints. And then the right of rebuttal, the right to reply to an individual when there's a personal attack aired on the airwaves. So those are going to be your three largest types of censorship or control on the media. I should also mention that the right to equal time, this applies equally to if a station, excuse me, refuses time to a candidate, they cannot then allow another candidate to it. So if the station refuses time to all candidates for the same office, none of them have the right to demand access. So if a station gives or sells time during an election campaign to one candidate for an office, it must make the same opportunity available to all candidates for that office. The second one, the right to fair treatment, you may also know, is the fairness doctrine. Is not limited to political office, by the way. It has a much broader reach than the equal time provision, mandating free airtime for the expression of issues of public concern and of the opposing views. So that's why you'll see after the lifting of the fairness doctrine that you're able to have much more narrow, outrage-based media programs that lean heavily to one side or the other. And the right of rebuttal, I should also mention, is stemming from a 1969 case, Red Lion Broadcasting Company versus the FCC, which is essentially broadening the scope of the right to reply when an individual is attacked on radio or television in a way that damages their reputation. They have the right to confront that. Okay, so just a couple more things here is access to government documents. Like I said before, it's really a very symbiotic relationship between government and the media because government relies on the media to get their message out while the media relies on government to provide them news gathering data. So here in the background, you'll remember that this woman was banned from a White House event. She is from CNN. We know that that's happened a number of times. But the press does not have a constitutional right to access the information that the public doesn't already have the ability to get. So they really are just making it easy for us to access it. But there's no constitutional right to access that, and that's why in this way the White House and State Departments can prevent certain individuals from gathering the news that they are seeking to do. So there is such thing as a privileged access, okay, but it's at the discretion of the authorities. States, however, define public records differently, and usually it's depending on how personal the level of information requested is, it's easier to get government documents, and it's even easier to access private records so long as you have waited the available amount of time. So after 25 years of the public official's death, private records for that official can become available. But again, because of issues of prior restraint, the news media can't publish documents that are matters of national security. What defines national security is the difficult part. If they can, and it is the burden of the government to prove when there is an issue of national security. So if they want to prevent the release of a document, in fact, I'll go on here, you'll see they have to make a compelling argument for why it would be an issue of national security. So you'll see this here is the Pentagon Papers, which we know during Vietnam was very controversial, and the government attempted to block the publication of the Pentagon Papers. You'll see here, this is the gentleman, Daniel Ellsberg, who was the one who put forth the initiative to try and get that one published. You would call him the whistleblower. Copied information and then gave it to the press. New York Times Company versus the United States was the Supreme Court case that ruled the government had been overcautious in classifying that information. So look at that gentleman. He looks so nice. But there's going to be a couple of more prominent examples of that tension between prior restraint, national security, and secrecy. The Pentagon Papers, I'm sure you're familiar with. You're also very likely to remember the Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks case that's happened, as well as Edward Snowden and the NSA. And you can read more on those, but I don't since those are so popular, I didn't bother making a slide about them. There's also something that we'll talk about in particular with your activity is the ability to restrain publication of or provide documents based on executive privilege. And that's when the executive have the right to conceal information that they deem sensitive to national security.